Can you believe it's been 2 years since the civil war in Syria began? Yes, 2 years, and nobody has a clear path to ending it. If you've listened to U.S. politicians lately, you've probably ended up thinking the choice is between arming Syria's rebels and not arming them. But we all know the risk of that, with al-Qaeda elements fighting against President Bashar al-Assad's forces. The real choice there is between dictatorship and terrorism. So how can the West get involved without compromising our interests? Everyone's been hoping to avoid this step, but is it time to consider military intervention? James Robbins, deputy editor of Rare.us and a person who's worked at the Pentagon, says it is time for an intervention, and he joins us from Washington. Jim, help me with this. Who are we supporting in Syria?
Well, that's a good question, because there are a number of different rebel groups, some of which are moderately pro-Western, some of which have ties to al-Qaeda. It's really a problem, and unless the Western powers get more involved in choosing sides on this one, they're going to wind up backing the wrong team. Okay, so help me with this, and I'm not trying to, be argumentative. It's just I'm basing these questions on recent history. How do we know that if we choose a certain side, a certain faction, and favor them and arm them, how do we know that that faction will end up governing Syria? Well, there's really no way to know what's going to happen. But the question is, do you want to have an influence on the outcome? And right now, it seems as though there is no influence, that it's just a chaotic civil war. As you said, you're either going to wind up with a dictator or with an al-Qaeda-backed theocracy. And we're at a stage now where unless Western powers, or particularly the United States, starts to get involved in some fashion and try to influence the outcome, that you'll just be left with those two choices and not have a third path towards a stable, democratic, hopefully pro-Western Syria. All right. Do we now believe that the intervention in Iraq will result someday in truly democratic Iraq? Because it seems to a lot of people that Iraq is still hanging by a tether. Well, Iraq has problems, that's a fact. They're closer to it than they were. They do have elections. They do have a form of democracy. And I want to clarify, I'm not talking about some kind of full-scale invasion into Syria and occupation with ground troops and things like that. I'm talking about giving the kind of aid like intelligence support, logistics support, air support, the kind of things that allow the rebel armies on the ground right now to have a chance of prevailing against the Syrian army and its Iranian backers. Would you agree, though, that giving that kind of support is still rolling the dice, that after Saddam, Assad, what's the difference? These Freudian slips take place all the time. But after the butcher of Baghdad, Assad, is toppled, regardless of who we have supported with aerial support, with all the rest of it, there's still, once again, no guarantee that if that moderate faction takes over, that an al-Qaeda-backed faction won't be able to stage a coup, because let's face it, they're far more interested in creating mayhem and doing violence and being brutal and being ruthless. And generally in the Middle East, he who is most ruthless scores the most points. Well, you're right. There's never any guarantee. It's just a question of whether we want to have even a chance of influencing the outcome. Because right now, the civil war is just going on its own. You've got a terrible refugee crisis. You have tens of thousands of people being killed. If there's a way to stop that conflict, bring more stability to the region, and hopefully be able to help whoever the successor is to rebuild that country, then I think we have a chance of steering them in the right direction. If you just let it go the way it's going to get worse and worse, and it could spiral into another type of crisis. So your take on it is that America should do more. Are you talking about a NATO effort? Or are you talking about something like the Libyan model? Something like the Libyan model, something like the Balkan intervention in the 90s, excuse me, when a few airstrikes helped solve that issue. Something that's a low commitment model where you don't have a lot of boots on the ground, maybe some special forces or something like that. and nothing that will arm a future threat. I'm not talking about giving lots of sophisticated weapons to the rebels, but giving them the kind of support that can be withdrawn later if they decide that they don't like the West very much.
Jim, let's talk about the politics of this. I don't have to tell you, you're sitting there in Washington. There is enormous intervention fatigue in America. And it's not just in the old days you could say, well, that's just those Vietnam, anti-Vietnam liberals and whatever. I mean, there's no way anyone can get away with that. Many conservatives are now feverishly and fervently opposed to any kind of intervention anywhere.
Well, you're right. There's intervention fatigue. There are budget pressures, the legacy of the other wars, domestic politics being much more important, all of these factors. I don't think you have a lot of public support to do anything in Syria. But unfortunately, our president, maybe unfortunately for him, kind of put his credibility on the line and the credibility of the country by drawing a red line and saying to Bashar Assad, if you use chemical weapons, it's going to be a game changer. We're going to do something. So the president pretty much committed the United States to take action should Syria cross that red line, which they did. So now the question is, do you back up your credibility of the administration, the credibility of the United States by taking some form of action? Again, not talking about a full-scale invasion, but something. Or do you just kind of let it slide and give the lesson to other rogue states like North Korea and Iran that U.S. threats are meaningless, that you can just go ahead, cross red lines, proliferate nuclear weapons, support terror groups, and do whatever you want?
By the way, is it somewhat disputable, the business about the red line and the use of chemical weapons? I only ask you because today the British, Cameron, said that his evidence is there is no evidence that they did not cross the red line, that Assad did not use chemical weapons.
Well, that's interesting. The British say that. The UN said it was the rebels who used chemical weapons. The administration, so far as I know, is sticking to their line that it was the Assad regime. They were using chemical weapons. Clearly, there was some confusion over this matter, and it would be good to clear that up. But if it turns out that chemical weapons were used, that puts the Obama administration back in their credibility issue.
Speaking of credibility, while I've still got a brief window here with you, give me your take on where we go from here on Benghazi and credibility of the Obama administration and what the consequences might be.
Well, the Benghazi issue is a big mess, but it's a mess of their own creation. As more information comes out, I guess we will see. But the critical questions are, what did they do before the event? What happened during the event? And then why this cover-up looking thing after the event when they were inventing a story about a mob attack and based on a YouTube video, which was a completely invented story. It had no basis in fact. And so the question is, why did they do that? Was it related to the election and so forth? And the administration had months to be forthcoming and come out on all these issues. But instead they stonewalled it. So now we're at the point where we have congressional hearings. And again, it's a self-inflicted wound. They should have just come out and been frank with the American people about these matters. And instead, we're going to have to suffer through weeks of discovery and a report and probably more stuff after this.
It's incredible how an election campaign can take the need for credible transparency hostage. Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. James Robbins in Washington. Don't forget to tune into our Chorus radio show in markets across this country, from Pacific to Atlantic in Toronto, Talk Radio AM 640. CJOB 68 in Winnipeg. In Calgary, it's QR. And in Edmonton, it's CHED. And in Saskatoon and Regina, it's the Rolco Partners.